Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Writers Chat. And this is the place where we just love to gather together as writers and talk about all things about writing, for writers, and by writers. And it's great to see everybody here today over in the chat room. And those of you that are watching by replay, we say every week, but we sincerely mean it, that we love it that you take some time for your own writing career and to be part of this community and stuff. It's such a neat, supportive community. So I feel honored to be part of it. My name's Jean Wise. I'm one of the co-hosts today, but I'm going to pop out and let Johnnie Alexander, one of our other co-hosts, and she's going to be joined by Norma and Melissa today, and I'm going to let them tell you what we're going to talk about today, and they're going to take the lead. So go ahead, Johnnie.
Hey everybody, we're really excited today to talk to you about a book that we've gone through together with a few other people in the very secret Writers Chat fiction group. Anyway, it's called Writing with Emotion, Tension, and Conflict by Cheryl St, and it really is a very, very helpful book if you're wanting to write novels and short stories and those kinds of things. So I'm excited to be joined today by Melissa Stroh and Norma Poore, and we're just going to sort of do this rotate here. So I'm going to do parts 1 and 4 in the book. Melissa's going to handle parts 2 and 5, and then Norma's going to do parts 3 and 6. So we're just going to barely cover the surface, but still just try to bring as much information from the book as we can. So starting right off, there's a little bit in the introduction. Cheryl St, again, the author of the book, she says that her #1 rule of writing and one of the most important concepts she's come up with from reading all kinds of books on craft is that a story is feelings. And she gets that from Dwight Swain, who wrote The Techniques of the Selling Writer. He's pretty famous for coming up with the whole, if you're familiar with the sequel scene idea of writing, where you write your scene. I said it backwards. You write your scene, excuse me, and then you write your sequel, and you just keep going back and forth like that. So a story is feelings. Now, there's all kinds of definitions for story, but this one's a pretty good one because the reader must care about the character, and they must care about what's going to happen to that character. And the only way you can make that happen is to have an emotional connection. So you want your reader to have an emotional connection with your main character or protagonist. And this is accomplished through conflict. And if there's no conflict, there's really no story, right? There has to be something happening. So part 1 is conflict makes the story. And your protagonist must have a believable goal. We know that there must be a story goal. Every great story out there. I was thinking about different examples like Frodo, and I think I want to mention this again a little bit later. What was his goal? It was to destroy that ring, to save Middle Earth. So not only did he have a specific goal, there were big stakes involved too. But basically, and I haven't really thought this through enough to know if there are any exceptions to this, but I really like this idea, and I think it's really great, especially at the beginning when you're developing a character. She says that the character must want, and there's 3 different things, so you can choose which one of those 3 that you might want your character to want, and then go with the story from there. So they want to possess something. So maybe they have a dream of, buying the mansion on the hilltop, or whatever, to possess something. They have a dream. They want relief from something. So maybe there's heartache involved. Maybe there's health conditions involved. Maybe there's just guilt or something like that. So they want to do whatever they can to be relieved from whatever nightmare or demons are haunting them. Or, and this is a good one, they want revenge. Like Captain Ahab wanted revenge from Moby Dick for biting off his leg. So that may be a really good starting point if you're, trying to develop a character and you're just kind of not knowing where to go. Possess something, relief from something, or revenge for something. but the goal must be specific and concrete. I run into this problem sometimes because I don't always have real specific and concrete goals. But one way I like to look at it, and this does not come from Cheryl, this actually comes from Randy Ingermanson, is who wants to do what, why. And Randy's famous example, I know I've used this before, he's the snowflake guy, just to put that in perspective. An astrophysicist wants to go back to the 1st century to murder the Apostle Paul. So you've got the who, the astrophysicist. What does he want to do? Travel back to the 1st century. Why? To murder the Apostle Paul. So, you know, just very clear. And if you can do that with your story, you've got a little bit of an elevator pitch right there. I mean, that is the beginning of one. So again, just think about some of your favorite stories and how you would say those. And you know, we might not always say them quite the same way, but we could still have the idea of the story. So here was my Frodo example. A hobbit wants to destroy a ring of power to save Middle Earth. I'm going to read the next two, and I think Norma and Melissa can tell me what these stories are. A Southern belle wants to be wealthy to save her family's plantation.
Gone with the Wind.
Gone with the Wind. A bookstore owner wants to meet the man she's been chatting with online to find true love.
You've Got Mail.
You've Got Mail. So see, I mean, you can take those and you can just really distill those stories down into who wants to do what, why, and I'm sorry, that is a rabbit trail because that was not in the book, but I thought it was really important. So it can help you figure out the goal, which is important. So knowing the goal, then you know the goal. Now you can create the appropriate obstacles which are going to lead to conflict, because the obstacles are going to keep your character from reaching the goal she has set for herself, and that's telling her no, and she's got to do something about it, and there's conflict right there. Now, of course, you want both internal conflict, which is emotional, and you want external conflict, which is outside obstacles. Okay, I sort of lost track of time, so I just so much, but I don't want to take up everybody else's time too. So let me move on. Okay, what conflict is, really quick, there's a list in here. It's intolerable. The character can't ignore or explain away the conflict. It's there, it's pressing on them, they have to do something about it. The conflict is not delay. You will read stories where the character all of a sudden can't find her car keys, or this is a classic, the cell phone doesn't work. It's worked fine, all of a sudden it doesn't. She says, Cheryl St. says, these aren't complications, these aren't obstacles, these are incidents. So it's okay to have these things happen, but don't count on them being your obstacles. Don't count on them being your conflict, because they're not. In fact, things like that, if they're overused, are just annoying, to be honest. Conflict is not anger, bickering, or foot stomping. Conflict is not the characters fighting with each other, but it's more about the character fighting with herself. And also remember, this is also kind of an extra here, anger is a secondary emotion, and you want to find out what is below that anger, and that is really what's driving the conflict. So feelings must be part of every effective conflict. Why? Because a story is feelings. All right, I have got real quick, just some really great quotes, and then I'm going to pass it over to Melissa. Our characters have to face their worst fears. This is another, this is one thing that I really try to dig deep into when I'm first creating a character, is what do they fear? What do they fear the most, and what do they want so much they will face that fear to get it? And she also talks about that concept. We have to know why. We have to understand the motivation for the character, why it's so important for them to want whatever it is they want, and to just keep going through all these obstacles to get there. Again, the example of You've Got Mail, Kathleen fears losing her mother's bookstore, and then what happens? She loses her mother's bookstore. So her worst fear actually comes true, but we see her moving beyond that, and that's growth as the character. Your antagonist, that's a person who's trying to keep your hero, your main character, your protagonist from reaching his or her goals. I love this quote. The antagonists who evoke the most emotion are the ones who could have been heroes if they had made better choices. I mean, that is just fabulous. So you just think about that. Think about some of the antagonists, the villains that have just really stuck with you, and think, oh my gosh, if they had just made better choices, could they have been the hero of their own story? And also remember that the antagonist believes he is the hero of his own story. So, don't make him just a dastardly, who is that person? Whips.
Snidely Whiplash.
Snidely Whiplash. Don't make him that. just just twirling his mustache. You've got to have more to him than that. Conflict requires a decision. Lots of times this is what makes middle of the book sag, is because you're not just keeping this going, that you need your character to make a decision. They can change their goals. So one thing, conflict can be in the form of information, because new information can change the character's goal and move the story forward. Just like you've got mail. Once that bookstore was sold, when she realized she couldn't keep it open, she had to come up with new goals for her life, and she decided she would write a children's story. So she's moving on. Types of new information. You have 6 weeks to live. What are you going to do now? How important now is that goal you started out with? Uncovering a lie. That's probably more something that you would have in your story than all of a sudden your character only has 6 weeks to live, because unless you're, well, never mind. Uncovering a lie. And then this is a classic. Luke, I am your father. Change the whole trajectory of that.
Mm-hmm.
3 final points. A character must make a sacrifice in order to be truly heroic and show growth. We've talked about this before. Even Scarlett O'Hara, who we think of as a very selfish character, sacrificed what she wanted to be most. In the book, it comes out more than in the movie. More than anything in the world, she wanted to be a lady like her mother, and she did very unladylike things because her goal of saving Tara was more important. Internal conflict is what gives the plot significance and keeps the characters emotionally at odds until the end of the book. External conflict can be used to keep characters together. External conflict does not keep characters apart emotionally. So that is the first part in a nutshell. The story is feeling conflict.
We've got some good questions going on.
Oh no, I don't know. We're gonna have to, let's try to do this, and then maybe go back and do the questions when we bring people on. Can we do that?
Yeah, we can do that.
All right, Melissa, because I think I went
Okay.
over my time
So
allotment.
I'll try. Part 2 is pretty significant in size, so I will try not to get too wordy and go in on this. Sum it up.
It's hard though.
It really spins off of the first one. It's called Once More with Feeling, and it really, this is my favorite chapter. It focuses on, I think, what is central to developing your character, and that's learning emotional triggers and what evokes the emotion, not only your character but in you, because what it stems from your characters ultimately stems from yourself. And so she really puts emphasis on the fact that you need to learn what triggers your emotions, what triggers emotions in other people, and to study that in order to develop it in your own characters and make them, feel like they come to life. And she suggested things like, observing people or in movies or in life in general, or even your favorite stories, to study your favorite book and get in there and look and see what scene really just popped out at you and just hit you, and study that scene and see what it was that made that character so dynamic, what, the emotional trigger. And so she even suggested, journaling about it so you have your notes to reference. And then she also suggested using method acting, which, actors use that. And I love that aspect. I do that in creating my own character sketches and method act, and see, well, if I were this character, how would I respond in this given situation? What would my visceral reaction be? And then she said, considering in like your movies, what makes you laugh? What makes you cry? What makes you fall in love? Any of those things that you can nail down will help you decide what kind of writing you want to do too. Maybe you're not sure about your genre. It's not just about your characters, but the books you're trying to develop. So then she goes into more detail about the characters' emotions. And if you can't make your reader care, then you've basically lost them. Your readers have to invest in your character. And if they don't care about your character's not believable, it doesn't evoke that emotion, then the story is flat. It's like the kiss of death is what she said. So the crafting believable characters really comes back to developing their backstory. And that's a tricky thing in writing a book. The backstory is, for those who don't know, it's basically everything that's happened to your character before this story took place that developed them into the person that they are, that he or she is, their life beforehand. And in backstory, the biggest thing that we all have to worry about is that balance. You want to be able to tease it, you want to foreshadow it, you want to kind of hint at things. You never want to info dump the backstory, especially at the beginning. Then I liked the comparison she had in the book. She compared it to a person you just met at a party who's telling you everything about their life and their surgeries and all this other stuff, and you're like, oh, can I get away, please? And then you compared, then in contrast, it's like your best friend who's just gone through this traumatic change, like her husband left her and cheated on her, and she's crying and sobbing and telling you everything, and you're invested in her because she's your friend. You know her, you know what she's going through. And so there's that difference there. If you haven't invested your readers in your character and you're just throwing all this info at them, they're like, okay, time to move on. Another book.
Yep.
I loved the comparison. Then she went on to internal narrative and deep point of view, and that's really important in a story. Internal narrative basically is the thought process, how they perceive things, and it's your insight into their mind. Sometimes it's conveyed in direct thought, which most of the time is done through italics. A lot of people are getting away from that, saying we don't want to do it anymore. In this book, Cheryl St. James refers to it, saying that you can use it, but use it sparingly. And I think so, because it can be a little jarring to put too much of the direct thought in. Internal narrative should be done in a deep POV still, even if it's not direct thought. It shouldn't be, you shouldn't use what she calls overly emotional descriptive words, like he thought, or she wished, or the worse still, he thought to himself. You say. I liked one of the examples, like a telling POV would be, he thought Gizmo was the funniest looking dog he'd ever seen. Well, you're telling him. In the direct, deep POV would be, Gizmo was the funniest looking dog he'd ever seen. Pretty simple. You're just taking out those telling words. And then here, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
The problem with looking over at your note. What was I doing here? Oh, the scene and sequel. You had mentioned that before, and that was something that she said is very effective in internal narrative. A lot of times the scene and sequel effect works for some people. I'm not as big into it when it comes to internal narrative, because the idea is you create the inciting incident, your scene, something big happens, like aliens take over the world, or somebody dies, or your main character gets kissed for the first time. This major event happens, and then your sequel is this character processing what just happened. How do they feel? What are they going to do with this information? And so in my mind, that automatically evoked like an entire scene for thought. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but some people do it that way to good effect. Let's see. So moving on to word pictures and digging more deeply. Let's see here. We kind of covered that. Just creating sympathetic characters. She talks about givens. there are certain givens that everybody just expects in a story, and that evoke a certain emotion in us, like children, babies, animals, a cowboy. You have a certain feeling that just is instantly evoked in your mind when you get somebody says these things, these people, and this emotion. Like an orphan, automatically you have thoughts about it. You're sympathetic. You feel the loss of the child and their lack just from hearing the word orphan. And so those givens can be used in a story to already evoke emotion without having to add much more to it. It automatically creates sympathy for characters. She then goes on to feeling the story, give an example of the movie Pay It Forward. And in that one, I'm not going to go into detail about the book and the movie itself, but she draws on important aspects of story development, like developing character flaws and motivation, and characters' goals, like long-term goals and short-term goals, and external and internal goals. And that sounds a lot more technical than what it is. But like you gave the example of Frodo, that would be the long-term goal. He wants to destroy the ring of power. So that's a concrete thing. He's working towards that ultimate goal. And there's going to be little goals along the way, like getting to Bree. That's one short-term goal. Finding some way to get to Rivendell, next goal. And they meet a ranger, Aragorn, and he helps them get to that point. So there's your short-term goals along the way. Then internal goal, like for Frodo, again, would be the example that he doesn't want the ring to consume him. He doesn't want to become evil like the ring has done to all of its previous masters. So his internal goal is to fight that and to ultimately reach and attain his long-term goal. Let's see here. Character flaws and motivation. Well, motivation kind of stems out of the goals. The motivation, of course, for Frodo to destroy the ring is to save Middle-earth and to save all that he loves, the Shire and everyone that he knows. So that's his motivation to go for his goal. His flaws aren't as distinctive as some other characters. I would say that's a little bit harder to pinpoint for me with Frodo. But as the ring starts to take hold of him, then his flaws become more apparent. He becomes more blind to his friends. And so that could be conveyed as a flaw. And so those are examples from movies.
It's really good.
And then finally, I think sacrifice and evoking emotion was the biggest focus. There has to be a sacrifice. Your character has to sacrifice something, or at the very least to take a big risk. And it doesn't have to be life and death. It doesn't have to be something that's super dramatic. It just has to mean something to your character. And if it means something to your character, then it's going to mean something to your reader. And ultimately, don't tell your readers how to feel, let them participate. And if you've done all those other things, that will naturally fall into place.
Right.
So did I do that out fast enough?
Okay. I'm in the hot seat now. Is it me?
Yes. You.
Part 3.
All right. Part 3 was a lot about your setting. And first, in chapter 13, it was defining your setting and observation. And she said the location is as important in your story as the character. You can't have one without the other. And so she gives some examples of that your setting affects your story. It can affect the emotion of your character. For example, if your character goes home after the death of a parent and it's been a troubling place, that's going to evoke a different emotion than if your character goes home to a place where she had a wonderful childhood and life was good, but perhaps life isn't so good now. So it brings back these warm fuzzies that she's not feeling right now. So setting is really important. So with that, she defined setting as a plot as a series of events that carry the story from beginning to end. So in your setting, in the middle of that is also your plot. And so things, even though the setting may change, your plot needs to be consistently changing with it. I hope that makes sense. And she said some settings are historical background, some settings are your own neighborhood, and some of them are completely imaginary. But she said no matter the setting, make sure that you have done your research, because even in a make-believe setting, you still have to make it feel real. And so she recommended, and if you're making up the world, even if it's in 2019, take a city that's near you and look at the different nuances of that city. If your character's in a big city and you live in a small city or smaller city, then go to a big city, map it out. Like take pictures and come back and draw a map. And so when you're saying things, you can actually say, well, she went down Lexington Street and turned left onto Fifth Street. But then you need to keep that map out because you need to remember later that that's where she is. So that you don't have her coming back up Lexington and turning right on, so you want to keep all that straight. My favorite chapter out of this was chapter 14, What Can Setting Do for Your Story? And she talks a lot in here about setting can intensify the involvement of your reader. And there are so many things, y'all, that I highlighted that it's just crazy. But she talks about using your 5 senses in your setting. Can you hear something? Can you smell something? Can your character touch it? Can they taste it? And so she really delves into the 5 senses in this chapter. And then she talks about setting can build your story world to suit the desired tone and impression you want to make. Like I said, there's so much in here, but what I want to do with this chapter is the thing that's really neat about this book is at the end of each chapter, she gives you some exercises to do to flesh out, if you will, what she's teaching you. And I thought this was really neat. And in this particular chapter, the assignment was, let me check my notes, make sure I'm doing this right. Yep. Is chapter 14. And it said the exercise was to take your main character, your lead character in the work that you're currently working on, and place her at a cemetery. Now, this isn't during a burial service. This is after the burial service. She's come back to visit. And so have your character look down and just watch your character. And it says, describe the weather, describe what she sees, what she hears, what she smells. Is it dank? Is it damp? Is it bright and sunny? What is she feeling? Is she sad? Is she, you got what you deserved, you dog? What is she feeling? And then look through your character's eyes down at the grave. Who is it? Who is your character looking at? And then to throw a twist in there, you and the character shared a secret that nobody else knew. What was that secret? So I'm working through this exercise, and I've been on this journey seriously for only a couple of years. I played at it for a few years before that, but I would hear writers like Johnnie and Melissa and many of you here talk about their characters talking to them. And I was like, okay, interesting. But doing this exercise, for the first time, my character talked to me. And I was like, it really happens. My character talked to me. Oh my goodness. I must really be a writer now. And so I had an idea of what was going to happen in this scene because, you know, I'm reading the directions and I'm just typing away. And it in my head, it was like, no, this is what's going to happen. And so that was really exciting for me, just saying. And so that was really a neat thing in this book. And my character was from an abusive past in her childhood and in her previous marriage. And so I knew that, but when I went to this cemetery, I was thinking it was going to be perhaps her ex-husband that was there. That was kind of my thought. But then I learned it was her. She faked her own death. And that was what she kept telling me. And she wouldn't let me get away from it. So there you have it. So that was really cool. That was a super neat exercise. It was kind of a turning point, if you will, for me. So that was really neat. Anyway, moving on to the next chapter is using indirect description. And basically here, she's just talking about that it's not so important what's happening in here in your story as much as how your character is reacting to what's happening. And that's where your indirect description of things is going to happen, where maybe she sees a dog, it's a poodle, and it reminds her of something from her past. And it stirs this, you know, she sees this poodle and she starts to cry. Well, who cries when they see a dog? But then there's that little bit of a picture like Melissa was talking about, where you can give a little snippet of the past without dumping it, or without the other thing they don't really do anymore like they used to is flashbacks. Remember, that was popular for a while. But sometimes a little snippet of something that's drawn from emotion, like seeing a dog like you had when you were little. So that's really what that chapter was about. And then chapter 16 was creating realism with your setting details. And details are important. It's the little things, and you have to be careful with your details because you don't want to forget what you already said, or forget something that happened, or get your characters' names mixed up. And in this chapter, she gives quite a few ideas, like creating 5 index cards with your characters and kind of have them posted around so you remember what they're doing as you're writing perhaps just that chapter or that scene, to help you remember where you are. Because she says, inevitably we all make mistakes, and readers are really quick to point that out. So you want to make sure you're keeping all your information in a way that you remember it, whether it's on cards, whether it's an outline where you're taking notes as you go, however you choose to do it. Then the next one, I've kind of already touched about this a little bit, is researching your location. She mentions that slightly when she's talking about defining your setting, and then she comes into chapter 17 and kind of like unpacks the box, so to speak. And she gives ideas of, again, mapping out places. If it's a real town, if your story is about your place, make a map of it. Take pictures. You want to do things, and she really emphasizes this, to bring credibility not only to your character, but to the setting. Because if your reader doesn't buy that the setting is a real place, they're going to quit reading as quickly as they would if they don't buy the character. So she said, be sure you back up all your research. Make sure you contact people if you're going to use it and you need to there's copyright on it. Make sure you take care of all of the technical kind of stuff. And she was saying she has books and books of research. And if we have time, one of the things that she talked about earlier in the book at the very beginning is she talks about establishing a notebook. And if we have time, we'll get back to that. And so in this book, you keep all your research about your characters, about your location, all this together. So as you're writing the story and you need it, you can pull it out. Because sometimes you gather this information, as I'm sure Melissa can attest to, but you don't use all of it. Melissa's writing historical fiction, for those of you that may not know. And I just lost my train of thought. Anyway, I know sometimes you have this mound of research about your place, and you don't need all of it, but you might need snippets of it. So you need to have it where it's easily accessible, and you want to keep it because you don't want to just depend on this, because as you just saw, this doesn't always hold out. Weaving, and then chapter 18 is weaving your tapestry. And this is talking about thinking about your word choices. It's, she ran to the store. Well, that's not real exciting. But if you added more to it, she was running to the store because, I can't, my mind just went blank again. I had an example. I'm sorry. But anyway, you have to have a reason for your reader to care why she's running to the store. Because we all know in order to cook or clean or wash clothes or use the bathroom, you got to have items, and they come from the store. So you have to make it interesting. There has to be a reason that your reader's going to care that she's running to the store. Is she running to the store to hide? Is she running to the store because she found out her mother-in-law is going to be there in 2 hours and she doesn't have good enough food to fix for this mother-in-law? You have the thread, I think, throughout the whole book is you have to make your reader care. If the setting's not good, if the character's not good, if even the words you choose are kind of blasé, they're gonna close your book and they're gonna stop reading. The other thing she talks about in this is make a list of compare and contrast. And she says your character has a past, and it's one of your most effective tools. Her experiences are needed for the base of her perception and reactions. And some of the contrast she gives as example is she's in a new town. She had a poor background, and now she's moving up in the world. Bad reputation, dysfunctional family. Good reputation, or with a family of that's upstanding. That doesn't have a dysfunction, which all of us know all families have dysfunction. Some are just a little more dysfunctional than others, and some of us know how to put the fun in dysfunction. I'm going to end with that and move on to the next.
Oh, that was great. So much good information. Okay, next part is part 4, tension and pressure. Tension is always about a questionable outcome, and truly you want to have tension on every page of your story. I know some of you, before we got on Writer's Chat, were watching a video where our hostess Bethany Jett was talking to Stephen James, and I'm pretty sure that this is like his big mantra: tension. There needs to be tension and rising tension, and that's what he believes the story is all about. So it's very, very important. You need to have tension on every page of your novel. This does not mean that it doesn't have to, again, be high stakes tension all the time, or high stakes conflict. Conflict and tension both can be very small, but they still need to be there. And it can be as simple as, like Norma was talking about, going to the store. And it's like, what if you want to go to the store, but someone's keeping you from doing that, but you really need to go? I mean, there's a little bit of tension there. It's not life and death by any means, but still it's tension, right? And that's what you want to do. You also want to think about pacing, though, with all of this. Even in action films where there's just nonstop action, there are stops. There are stops to reflect, to make a new plan, to breathe, yes, to catch your breath, sometimes for maybe a romantic moment. I mean, you think about our favorite Marvel movies over the last 11 years, and as much action as was in those, you still saw a lot of quiet moments. And we love, I mean, we love those quiet moments, right? Where it just gets us more in tune with the internal person rather than what they can do externally as a superhero. Actually, that is a really good example. I mean, it truly is, because when you think about them and they can do all these things, and that's all external, and it's always about saving the earth, right? I mean, these are big stakes, and yet these very, very quiet moments, like Steve Rogers kissing the CIA girl, you know, for the first time under the bridge, and they're about ready to go fight the other Avengers, but we have this very quiet moment, and the two guys in the other car kind of going, oh yeah, you know, about time that happened. But we see just this little moment with them and their relationships with one another. Again, rabbit trail, sorry. Ask what's the worst thing? Exactly, character development. And this again comes, you know, Cheryl says this in her book. I know Stephen James says this a lot when he teaches. What's the worst thing that can happen? Make it happen. And, you know, you really just go deep and deep and deep with that. Is this the worst thing that can happen? So what was the worst thing that could happen to Kathleen Kelly and You've Got Mail? To lose her mother's bookstore. What could be more devastating than to lose the place where you had grown up as a child, where your mother had made a success of this, where you were this little place in this big city, you know, that brought people together, and yet it happened. Somebody said once, burn the letters. He was talking about a book he had written where all the information, everything that could explain what was going on, what, you know, was like the solution to the mystery, was in this packet of letters, and a character takes them and tosses them in the fireplace. So now they're gone. Burn the letters. What could have been worse than that? And now they don't have that source of information anymore. And of course, with Stephen James, he really gets brutal with his, if you've read his books, he gets kind of brutal with what's the worst that can happen. Remember rule number 1, we talked about at the beginning, a story is feelings. And what we really want to do here, and why we want to have tension, and why we want to have pressure on our characters, is because that's going to keep the reader turning the pages, and that's what you want to do. So here's just a few little quick things on how to keep the reader turning the pages. Keep them in suspense by not giving answers. You know, a story is a series of, well, life too, I think, is a series of questions. And as those questions get answered, you need to be bringing up new questions so that the reader still wants to follow. I know that there have been books that I've opened that the writing's maybe not been that great, didn't really like the story, but there was a question, and it's like, I need to find out how this happened. And I would go ahead and read the story anyway, because, you know, I could look past everything else, all the flaws, because the story was, or the question was so compelling. I wanted to see how they were going to get around this, how this was going to happen, how you know, how the author was going to work it. So present questions, reveal enough information to keep the story moving forward. Tap into a comfort zone or a childhood security or insecurity. I think this kind of goes back to Melissa talking about the givens, you know, like the orphan. If we have a story about an orphan and a dog, you know it's going to be a tearjerker, right? And so right away, you're just tapping into that. But, you know, foods, a lot of us have foods that just take us right back to our childhood. Smells can take us right back to our childhood. And it can be a good memory and maybe be not such a good memory. But you can have your character have that situation, and probably your reader is going to also respond to that emotionally because they've got similar memories in their background. Yeah. Ground the reader in what he knows, and then take him where you want to go. Again, tap into a feeling, and the reader's memory will go along with it. Familiar things stir memories, good or bad. Familiar fears, needs, or insecurities also stir feelings, make the reader feel. And then as a practical thing, and I love this about this book, is Melissa and Norma both have talked about practical writing suggestions, like he thought, just knock that right out of there. And so in this section with tension, she talks about showing and telling. And honestly, if you are staying in deep point of view, you're going to have a better chance of showing and not telling. And she does talk about when it's appropriate to tell, because there are sometimes it's very appropriate to tell. Otherwise, your book would be 1,000,000 pages long. So, she gives that practical advice too about verbs and these words that you can look for, like just and that's the only one, weasel words that we call them. So you can look those up. I mean, just these words that just sort of fill up space but don't really mean anything. And then the last one in this part is physical responses and body language, and how does your story person react to a particular situation or setting. And not everybody's going to react the same way, but there are also our bodies do tend to react the same way also. Like if we hear bad news, we immediately feel it in our stomach, our shoulders sag, all this kind of thing. Now, whether we fall to the ground and cry, whether we just kind of hold it inside, that may depend upon our own temperaments. But there are going to be physical reactions, physiological reactions. And of course, so I'm going to show the Emotion Thesaurus. I think a lot of us have this book, and it tells different emotions and what your body may be feeling and how your body's reacting. And you can also just think about what you do. I mean, what do you do when you hear bad news? Just go back to that place. Or good news, go back to that place. But then make it true to your character too. Use that physiology, but then also have their reactions be true to them. And that's the end of my part. I'm handing it back over to Melissa.
Okay, one of my favorite parts is part 5 on dialogue, because I am obsessed with dialogue. In fact, I will create whole scenes that are nothing but a string of conversation. And then I have to go back in and I have to add in that internal monologue and the action and description, because I just get caught up in the conversation. And I think dialogue can do so much for a story. And Cheryl St. agrees with that. She says that well-written dialogue is often more powerful than narrative. It's the life's blood of your story. And I agree. Dialogue is not real speech. This so needs to be emphasized. It has to be purposeful and compressed. In real life, our speech is full of lots of ums and huh and I do a lot of umming even through this because I get uncomfortable talking in front of people. So there's a lot of but your characters can't do that. Your characters have to get the point. The dialogue should move the story along. It should help the story progress. And it has to convey your character to some degree. Dialogue is so good for revealing your characters' personalities, their quirks, their goals, their motivations. All of that can be conveyed in what they say, their insecurities, their personal beliefs. There was another one of those ums that escaped in there. It'll sometimes used to deliver information. You got to be careful there. Dialogue can sometimes be used to detriment in that people overdo information dumps in dialogue and have your characters be unrealistically telling all these information just so you can reveal your research. I've seen it happen way too much. Tension can really be conveyed in dialogue. And one of the best ways that you can convey tension in dialogue is through subtext. And I think she was, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that. The biggest thing, again, going back to your characters and developing your characters, is the way that they sound. The dialogue needs to sound like the person that you have created them to be. It has to convey your character, their speech rhythms. How do they talk? How do they sound? She emphasized studying how people sound and how people speak. That's not something we always consider. It's more of a kind of a subconscious thing. Like, think about your favorite actors. Well, we know certain actors whose voices are very distinctive, like Anthony Hopkins or Tom Hanks or Morgan Freeman. No, they have very distinctive speech patterns and tones. And so maybe your character isn't quite that distinctive, but you try to picture in your mind how they might sound. And my characters present quite a challenge there, because my characters are all Irish and they're speaking Old Irish. So I have to convey something that sounds old, that sounds period appropriate, but yet isn't so bogged down that people don't want to read it. And I have to try to convey an accent without, again, overdoing that as well. And so you begin to think about a rhythm in your mind. Yeah, somebody, Alan Rickman, yeah, very distinctive voice. But yeah, you start to study people, and it doesn't have to be even actors and actresses. You're people watching out in public, in the coffee shop or someplace, and you might be listening in on a conversation, and you get certain rhythms from people, certain tones and even gestures, which can be thrown in, because that's another important aspect about dialogue is throwing in your beats and your actions. And that can convey a character so well, especially if there's something that they typically do along with the tone or a comment that they make that is distinctive to them. It endears you to the characters. When in doubt, use said.
Yes.
It's so important, because people like to try to get overly flowery, the purple prose and the descriptive of how they spoke. He spewed it out, or he ejaculated it. Okay, how does a person do this stuff in their conversations? Okay, maybe a person who can actually growl, but can they growl their words? They can grind a little, but you got to be really careful about your descriptive words, talking about how they speak, because it can really come across wrong.
Yeah. Yes.
So when in doubt, use said. Said actually has a way of just disappearing into the sentence, and it's not as noticeable as some people think. Expressing emotion. We gone over that in the developing of characters and internal narrative. Get rid of the oppressive feeling words in dialogue. Use dialogue to convey the emotion itself. You know, if somebody's scared, they're stuttering, they're using clipped sentences, you can tell by the way they speak that they're scared. You don't have to say, she said, scared for her life. And then subtext, that's where I was going with it. Subtext conveys emotion and tension so well, because you can tell in the train of the thought of the conversation that they're not addressing an issue, they're talking over the top of it. And you know, because you've developed these characters already, that this is happening. I gave an example a long time ago from my own work about subtext, where you had these two people talking, a guy and a girl, and it was clear there was some tension between the two, both sexually and, you know, on the surface, but they were both keeping a secret, and they were trying to be secretive about it in their conversation while still getting to the point. Why are you here? What are you doing here? And subtext really works well to pull your readers in, because not only are they invested in that current conversation, but then you might not have revealed some of that backstory in that subtext. So then they're wondering, okay, what's going on? What's this underlying issue between these two characters? And you pull them in and you create tension that way. I think that covers about everything on dialogue. So I guess on to you, Norma.
All right. And in this last section, section 6, it's more about your character. And through here, she talks a lot about your character needs to be their own person. They don't need to be you or a variation of you. Now, most writers, most authors, there's a piece of them that's probably in many of their characters, but it doesn't have to solely be a reflection of them. And so you want to, as Melissa already alluded to, you want to people watch. You want to see how people move when they talk, their facial expressions. You want to hear the way they talk? Do they use a lot of contractions? Are they more of a formal speaker? Do they use a lot of slang? And so those are the kinds of things, because you want, and in your story, you want each of your characters to sound different. Excuse me, because otherwise it all muddles together and it's just one voice. And the reader is going to get bored and close the book. One of the things that I like that she talked about in chapter 25 is what's in a name. And she said, you know, sometimes we have a hard time coming up with a name for our character. And she gave several resources. You can Google baby names, and a lot of those resources will also give you the meaning of the name, which maybe will help with deciding if that works with your character or not. And the other thing she said was use the Social Security, it's ssa.gov, and it lists all kind of names from different time periods as well. And so if your book is 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, you can kind of go back and see, or maybe a couple of your characters are 70 or 80 years old, and you want to go back to see what popular names were around at that time. And so I thought that was really a neat idea. And she keeps a running book. She said she has probably a dozen books just with names and their meanings and all this. And she, of course, she has them categorized, historical and all this different kind of stuff. So I thought that was really neat advice, because, and the other thing she said is she gave the example of she was writing this story and it just kept, she couldn't go very far with it. And so she was revisiting it and trying to figure out what was going on. And she kept the first name the same, but then changed his last name. And that did it. The gates opened and everything came. He just wasn't the right person. His name wasn't right. And he kept bugging her. He kept talking to her, this isn't right. And until she fixed it, the story went nowhere. So names are important. And so you want to take care of that. And I just did one of those ums too. There you go.
Norma, we are running out of time, so maybe one more quick thing, and then we'll ask everybody back on and talk about next week. I'm sorry. I mean,
that's okay.
So much.
It's okay. The last big thing that she really emphasizes is, along with names, is giving your character their own personality. And if you're not too sure about personalities, she spent about half of a chapter talking about Enneagrams. And there's like 9 categories of that. And it's basically a personality profile. And that's a great thing to use for your characters. And then at the end, the last chapter, she gives all kind of worksheets, if you will, of how to develop these things. And she says that she gets asked all the time, what is the one key to becoming a good writer? And she said, well, the one key is there isn't one key. And she said, but there are a few things that you can do. Believe in yourself, find someone who believes in you, work hard, push yourself, look fear in the eyes and overcome, set quotas and deadlines, get rid of distractions, find inspiration, polish, edit, revise, and repeat. Study, always be a student of your craft, follow through and complete every project, and hold tight to your dream. And there you have it.
Very, very good.
Part 6.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to have to catch up, because I know there was just so
okay.
much more. It's the
that was a highlights.
Yes, it was. So anyway, there you have it. Again, we highly recommend writing with emotion, tension, and conflict. I don't know if Bethany can come back on. If you can, you could tell us about next week. Stephanie Jones is going to be here again, but there you go. Why don't you tell us about next week? Thank you.
You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, okay, Stephanie Jones is just an amazing person, can I just say. She's all about giving back, and she's created a brand around Giving Gal, which is her website. She's self-published 2 books, does very well, and she speaks additionally to organizations, business industries, Chamber of Commerce. Like, she's really developed a niche on how to get speaking engagements outside of the churches. We've talked about how churches can be hard to get into because of that trust factor. So the conversation is going to be about should you self-publish, and how to know, like, if you're ready for that, if you can sustain the book sales on your own, and also how to find those speaking engagements that are relevant to your book topic, because she's doing just super great things with it. So she'll have like actual, like if you're a one-man show or one-woman show, she'll tell you how to be able to do this with tips that you'll be able to take away and start implementing. And I'm looking forward to doing it with traditionally published books as well. So I'm just beyond excited about her next week.
Sorry, I was muted. Someone asked for the SSA website. I'm trying to get it, but I'm having to go to a different computer to get it. And I think I have it, but I'm not sure I do. So anyway, thank you, everybody. We know this was like a real fast and just pouring out tons of information. But thank you for being with us. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Norma. This has been a great book. We do highly recommend it. And thank you, Bethany, for talking about next week. And we'll hope to see y'all then. Bye-bye.